When I review books, one of the things I often find myself thinking about and talking about in my reviews is how satisfying I find the ending. And recently I have been thinking a lot about books that have ambiguous or unresolved resolutions. This happens mostly in literary fiction more than I see it in the sci-fi, fantasy, historical fiction area. But in particular, two books that I've read fairly recently ended in ways that I found very unsatisfying for kind of the same reason. And that made me think about some other books that I have read recently that also had ambiguous endings, but that worked really well. So the three books that I really enjoyed the endings of were The Idiot by Elif Batuman, Normal People by Sally Rooney, and Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. The two books that had unsatisfying endings were Intermezzo by Sally Rooney and Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. Now, both of those books involve essentially love triangles. So Intermezzo involves a character named Peter who was in a very serious long-term relationship with a woman named Sylvia. Sylvia gets into a serious accident and is unable to engage in physical intimacy, and so she ends the relationship. Peter then falls in love with a much younger woman named Naomi. And a lot of the book is about Peter trying to balance the romantic feelings that he still has for Sylvia with the burgeoning romantic feelings he has for Naomi. And the end of the book is basically those three characters deciding to just try to be a kind of throuple thing where Peter is maybe gonna sort of date both women. And Detransition Baby similarly features a weird love triangle. So there's the main character who is living life as a man, but used to live as a trans woman, and then because of the sort of just social pressure and discrimination and overall difficulty, detransitions and ends up getting one of his coworkers pregnant. And the two of them decide to try to raise the baby together. But the main character isn't comfortable being seen in a purely masculine father role. And so he asks if he can bring his ex-girlfriend, another trans woman, into the relationship to also help raise the baby as a third parent. And both of these books end without really explaining what's going to happen. So in Detransition Baby, at the end, the characters aren't sure if they're going to keep the baby and try to raise it together, or if they're basically just all going to kind of break up and go their separate ways. And in both Intermezzo and Detransition Baby, the endings felt like we didn't get to find out what was going to happen next because the authors themselves didn't really know how to end the stories. It seems like in Intermezzo, Sally Rooney doesn't really know how these three characters are going to balance having these sort of two separate ongoing relationships at one time. And it similarly seems in Detransition Baby, like Torrey Peters doesn't really know whether the characters are going to end up keeping this baby and try to raise it together or not. And that feels very unsatisfying. There's a lot left to be said in both of these situations, like whether these three characters keep the baby in Detransition Baby, and that's going to have a significant impact on the rest of their lives, and we just don't get to find out how they make that decision, and it just feels very abrupt. And Intermezzo is kind of the same. The characters decide they're going to try to do this unconventional relationship, and then we never actually get to see them do it. And I want to contrast that with all three of these books that I just mentioned that I think do ambiguous endings really, really well. So the first one is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. This is a book about a young woman's basically college freshman year. And during that year, she develops a crush on an older student who sometimes seems to reciprocate the crush and is flirtatious with her, but also always has a girlfriend and so is never really available to be in a relationship with her. And the main character never really figures out how that other student felt. In the end of the book, basically that student graduates and the relationship sort of fizzles. And we never find out, did he really like her? Is she going to try to pursue the relationship? Are they actually going to, try to go somewhere with this relationship? Or did he just never really like her that much in the first place? And it works because it feels very true to life. College is such a unique stage in a person's life development where you are all of a sudden thrown together with all of these people your own age on this little campus, living in this little bubble, and you see them every day and you develop these relationships that feel very deep and meaningful, but often are really the result of proximity. And I think most people who graduate college go through this surreal experience of all of a sudden, all of these relationships with people that you saw every day, that you considered your close friends, just kind of disappear. And you keep touch with some people who you find out who the people were that you actually really, really mattered to you and that you will end up keeping in touch with. But many of the relationships just kind of fall off and they don't have a resolution. It's not like you decide, I don't want to be friends with this person anymore, or like you maintain the relationship forever. They just sort of stop appearing in your life and you don't notice it's happened until it's happened. And so even though this book doesn't resolve how this relationship ends, it feels very honest and realistic that it ends in this sort of ambiguous and abrupt way, because it is about a particular kind of relationship at a particular stage in life that often does end in this ambiguous and abrupt way. Another book where I think an ambiguous ending really works is Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is about two young people, Marianne and Connell, who are in high school together and they have a situationship in high school, and then they break up and they get back together in college, and then they break up again, then they get back together. And the end of the book, Connell gets an opportunity to move to America, and they're maybe going to break up again. It's sort of unclear. And this book, also the ambiguity works because it falls into the cycle that these characters have already been in. So the whole book is about this sort of toxic cycle where they're like magnetically drawn to each other, but they aren't able to communicate honestly. And so they keep having these miscommunications and ending up breaking up. And this cycle that they're in just seems like they can't break out of it. And so Connell having this opportunity in America and them not really being able to express to each other their true feelings about the relationship and what they want means that maybe they're going to break up and maybe he's going to go to America. But you can see as the reader that this just falls into this same cycle. And he's probably going to come back from America someday, and then they're going to get back together, and then they're going to break up over something else and get back together again. And so the ending, even though it is ambiguous in that we don't explicitly textually know where the relationship goes, it falls into this pattern where you as the reader actually 100% know how this is going to go, because we've been seeing the same thing happen over and over for these characters. And so you can predict pretty confidently, okay, actually I know how these characters are going to resolve this conflict. And then the third book where I think an ambiguous ending really works is Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. In this book, this is a book about a woman living in the late 1800s who is in prison for murder. And at the end of the book, she basically serves a 30-year sentence and then is released from prison. And it's about her relationship with a man who was trying to help her get released early because he believed that she was innocent. And at the end of the book, you never actually find out, was she guilty or innocent? And that works really well because it falls into the themes of the book. There are sort of two key themes of the book that are served by the ambiguity. One is it's a book about narrative and storytelling. It is based on a genuine historical trial, and the trial testimony was very ambiguous and contradictory. And when people are telling stories and, stories are being told from various perspectives by people who themselves have only lived a piece of the total action. And so storytelling itself is this sort of inherently imperfect medium, and we never really know what is the truth. Often there isn't necessarily one truth, in the sense that lots of different people can experience the same events in different ways. And even though this book only is explicitly ambiguous about the sort of overall guilt or innocence of this character, like that's the main ambiguity, the fact that that's never resolved makes you as the reader have to confront the fact that actually you don't know if any of what you've been told is really true, or if it's someone's biased perspective, or if it's an incomplete story. And so the ambiguity really works as part of this theme about how narratives are constructed and how the construction of narratives interacts with truth and our ideas about objective truth. And the other key theme that it really intersects with is a theme about responsibility, and the responsibility that people have for their actions when they are in situations of very limited autonomy. So the main character here is, she's a woman living in the 1800s. She doesn't have a lot of choices in her life. Her life is very controlled by her employers and by men and, by her economic circumstances. And so one of the other big questions is, when someone has had so much of their autonomy taken away by the people in their life and the circumstances in their life, how responsible can they ever really be for their choices? And so again, the ambiguity here kind of makes it seem like her guilt or innocence actually doesn't even matter, right? It's not even really about whether she did it, because ultimately the forces that were compelling her to act in the way that she did or didn't are, it's really about those forces and about the impact that they've had on her, rather than her ultimate responsibility for the choice that she made. And so I think this book too really takes advantage of the ambiguity of the ending because it serves those key themes. By contrast, I don't think the ambiguous endings of Normal People or of Detransition Baby really play any of those functions. So, it doesn't seem realistic that these relationships, these two love triangles, would sort of end in an ambiguous way, right? Like, you have to actually make a decision about whether someone's going to have this baby, and that's not a relationship that can just fizzle. Like, your relationship with the person having your baby, or if you are having the baby, that's not something that just can sort of end with no choices being made about it, right? And, similarly with this love triangle, Peter is going to have to ultimately make sacrifices in terms of how to prioritize these two people in his life. And someone is going to get hurt and someone is probably going to be sacrificed. And, these two women are able to connect and build a relationship with each other, but we never actually see them confront the hard stuff. It doesn't feel like the kind of ending that in real life, this relationship, this conflict would be solved when these three people just decide, we'll just allow, the main character, Peter, to date these two women. Like, that's actually when all of a sudden there's going to be all this conflict and these tough decisions to be made that are really interesting, and that the reader, I, at least as the reader, felt quite robbed by not actually being able to engage with in the text. And, similarly, neither Detransition Baby nor Intermezzo is, has set up a sort of historical precedent that allows me as the reader to predict how the characters are going to, actually deal with this situation in a way that resolves it. And I didn't really feel like the major themes of either of those books were well served by the ambiguity either. So, in Intermezzo, the main thing Peter is dealing with is the sort of the way that convention and his deference to convention restricts him from being able to live the life that he wants to live. He feels like he shouldn't have feelings for this younger woman, and he feels like he shouldn't be able to have a relationship with someone who isn't able to engage in physical intimacy. And Sylvia, the woman who has had the accident, feels like she shouldn't, claim Peter despite not being able to give him all of the things, that she should be able to give him in a fulfilling relationship. And so these characters are, by making this choice to be together, sort of chucking the these constraints of convention in society. But then we don't actually ever get to see them, like to see the rubber hit the road, right? And so I don't think the lack of follow through here serves to emphasize that theme at all. And similarly with Detransition Baby, that is dealing with a lot of the intersections between, so the woman who gets pregnant is Asian, and the trans woman and the main character, who is now living as a man but was a formerly trans woman, are white, and they have these sort of very interesting interactions about sort of the way that their lack of privilege in certain areas of their life enables them to be, to sympathize with other kinds of people's lack of privilege in different ways, and also how that only goes so far. And so then the reader is set up in this situation where these characters have different levels of sort of power in their interpersonal relationships and in society for different reasons, but we don't actually get to see how they then act on that, right? We don't actually get to see who gets what they want in the end, and how do they get it, and who makes the choice to sacrifice, one person or the other. And so again, as the reader, I just felt very robbed of a resolution there. And I don't have a big takeaway. I just wanted to chat a little bit about this phenomenon that I have been noticing in what I've been reading recently. I would be interested to know in the comments if there are any books you've read with ambiguous resolutions and whether you thought it worked or didn't work. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.